Cairns. I'm a co-facilitator for the Barossa Improved Grazing Group. Just to give you a quick background on BIGG, we are a producer group and we cover different livestock production groups in the Barossa and surrounding areas. So there's a sheep group, a beef group, a dairy group and 2 ag bureaus. We're administered by the Angaston Ag Bureau and supported by a very active advisory committee. Our vision is to be a trusted and valuable network supporting innovative, sustainable and resilient grazing businesses. So you'll see on a slide there on the screen, at the moment we're involved in an MLA pasture producer demonstration site project, looking at maximising pasture production in a variable climate. We've also got one of the first soil moisture monitoring projects happening in pasture situations to better manage our climate variability. We also send out monthly newsletters and lots of information and videos and case studies and fact sheets. You'll see our website there and you can find out any other information there. We're also running a containment feeding webinar in December, so keep your eye out for that one. This webinar tonight, as you know, seasons are all changing. We're getting much more variable climates. The season at the moment is warming up and our soil moisture is dropping, so our pasture quality is declining. We need to start some careful monitoring to ensure our livestock are in the right condition, particularly when we're preparing for joining, which a lot of us in South Australia are doing. This webinar will be presented by Hamish Dickson. Hamish is a Principal Consultant for AgriPartner Consulting and has over 15 years experience in the agriculture industry, working in roles both on-farm and off. He has specialist knowledge of ruminant production systems and is regularly called on to assist with advice, training and research in sheep and cattle nutrition, management and financial analysis. So thank you, Hamish, for running this session for us. We'll be covering condition scoring and measuring livestock production, setting and achieving livestock production targets, matching pastures with livestock requirements, and we'll be planning for the season ahead. This webinar is supported by MLA and the South Australian Murray-Darling Basin NRM Board and the Adelaide and Mount Lofty NRM Board through funding from the Australian Government's National Landcare Program and the NRM levies. So that's all the guff. Now we'll get started on the polls. I'll hand over back to Carlin and she's going to take us through the polls. Thanks, Carlin.
Thanks, Georgie. Just to familiarise Hamish and Georgie with who's listening tonight, the first question we're just going to ask the group is, where are you listening in from tonight? If you'd just like to click on your screen and cast your votes. Someone's just written a question that they can't see anything on their screen. What you need to do is make sure you open the icon at the bottom of your screen that looks like a little flower. That is actually the webinar screen, so that should help you. You actually have to open that viewer down the bottom of your screen to see it. All right, I can see that 3/4 of you have voted. Anybody else want to jump on and vote? Okay, so the results there is 1/3 of you are from the Barossa and 1/2 of you are from interstate. So as you fill out the evaluation as you leave this evening, would you just mind telling us as part of that what town and state you're from? That would be very handy for Georgie's evaluation. The next question is, what is your predominant production system? Are you merino sheep, maternal or composite sheep, breeding cattle, trading cattle or other? So just pick your dominant production system, please. Okay, so the group there is about 1/4 merino sheep, 40% breeding cattle, 17% trading, and also some crossbreds in there too. And the final poll, just before we pass over to Hamish, is, can you tell us what is your predominant pasture system, please? Annual pastures, perennial pastures, mix of annual, perennial, cropping and stubbles or other? Okay, just wrapping those up. So the majority is from that perennial pasture system, with some mix of annuals and perennials and the rest as annual pastures. So I'll just put those results up there, sorry. Okay, so that's a bit of demographics who's out there tonight. I'm just going to pass the baton over to Hamish, so his presentation will now come up.
Alrighty, that should be showing through now, I think, for everyone. Is that right, Carlin?
All good, Hamish.
Excellent, not a problem. All right, look, thanks everyone for, I guess, logging on tonight, and thanks for the invitation to speak. Georgie's obviously introduced the topic really well, and what I'm just going to go through is probably some more information around certainly how we can actually look at the pasture quality at the moment and how we match that with livestock requirements. But before we fire into that area of tonight, I think it's actually really important that we go through some of the lead up information around setting production targets, looking at the season ahead, and also some information on the condition scoring and measuring livestock production. It's an area that I think is really important in terms of the working through why there should be so much importance placed on managing pasture quality and how we actually manage any shortfalls, especially, as Georgie mentioned, as we're leading up to joining in many areas of South Australia. And the information that we'll go through can equally apply to other parts of the year as well in terms of the process to work through. But I think one of the really important things to go through is understanding what is the production target that we're trying to achieve. And if I think back through a lot of the time that we spend working with clients on some targets that they're trying to achieve, you know, a common one that we always hear is, right, we're trying to improve marking percentages, for example, and they might say in a sheep enterprise, and we'll focus a little bit on sheep, but much of the process and the information is equally applicable to cattle. But if we look at marking them up, so right, we want to try and achieve 120% marking, and that in one instance is a production target that we're trying to get towards. Now, in reality, we need to be putting some numbers around that in terms of how we're going to get to there and by what time to make sure that that objective is achievable. But the first place is to really get a very clear understanding of where are we now, so that we can really understand what's the improvement that's required and how are we going to gain that improvement as well. So it's actually really important that we start digging into the numbers, and we clearly dig into the numbers to identify where that gain can be made. And I might get the response back saying, well, look, we want to get to 120, we're currently marking 110%. And on face value, often I'll go, okay, that's actually pretty good. You know, we've got a good base there to work from. There's probably a few areas we can tweak and try and shift that up. But when you start to dig into the numbers a bit more, we might find we've joined 2,300 ewes, but when you actually crunch down into the numbers of lambs marked, in this particular instance, it was 2,236. So instantly those numbers don't quite line up in terms of giving us a marking percentage of 110. In reality, what happens is that it was actually 2,066 ewes there at marking time, and they've used the marking figure based off the ewes present at marking, not the ewes joined. So their true lambing rate, their true marking percentage effectively is 97%, and that starts to change things in terms of how we manage the whole system going forward. So it's really important that we have a really good understanding of where our production levels are for any attribute. So it's not just focusing always on marking, but this is a good example of the importance of it all. But we have to really understand the true numbers behind it all. So in that particular instance, when we're looking at these targets, the next thing is, okay, well, if we're trying to get to 120%, we have to start to look at, well, where do we focus our time? Are we having potential issues with conception, with joining? So this is a really important discussion right now. Or are we actually looking at issues in terms of survival, lamb survival later on? So then we need to start having some information available to us around things like our pregnancy scanning results. So in this instance, we've actually got a situation where scanning overall is at about 134%. So in this sort of situation, the scanning figures are actually relatively low, and to achieve 120%, well, we're not really going to get there if we're only scanning 134% on board. So this sort of data and this sort of analysis is actually a really critical first step in terms of working through what are our production targets, how likely are we to be able to hit those targets, and basically put a plan of attack together from that point forward. If you take it another step on, and we're actually really trying to look at how can we improve this enterprise, then we've still got this target of trying to get to 110 or 120%. The next thing is, where does scanning lamb survival come into play? And in this particular instance, we could start to see that a big driver of those losses, of that lower marking percentage than what we wanted, was largely due to twin lamb survival. And this is a pretty common situation in that most of the time we might actually have quite reasonable single lamb survival figures, but it's the twin lamb survival that's actually quite low. So overall, the reason that we're going through this information as an example is that it actually really sets the tone for having very clear targets for the enterprise, and using those targets to drill down into where the errors are or where the opportunities are in terms of actually improving productivity. So using this information, you can soon see that we've actually got to try and get the marking percentages up in the twins, and all the survival up in the twins, and we've got to improve also the scanning or the conception rates as well. So once you've actually got that information lined up, then it comes down to, well, how can we achieve that? And when we're looking at how can we improve conception rate, one of the biggest drivers is actually your condition score at joining. So to do this, we need to be very closely managing the condition score of those ewes at joining time to try and make sure that we can actually boost those conception rates higher and higher. So this starts to give us some direction as to how we might need to manage nutrition, so that, you know, in essence, we can start to make sure that we've got ewes that are at least at, say, score 3. So that graph on the left-hand side shows us that really, if we're trying to achieve 120 lambs born per 100 ewes, so 120%, we have to have those ewes at least score 3 at joining time. So that gives us some clear guidance as to how that might work. So equally, when we look at the number of ewes that are joining, and then the percentage of twins and singles and dries across all of those animals, it also starts to show us that we have to have those ewes at score 3 at least to try and generate enough twins on board to get our scanning percentage and equally our marking percentage up to a high number. So all of this information can start to feed into the management strategies that we have. And this is just one, I guess, small production target that you may set in your enterprise. It's a really important process to work through to make sure that when we are working through the importance of managing nutrition and what's the cost benefit of it, we have a very clear outcome in mind in terms of why we're doing it and why we can justify the expense that may be involved in feeding animals. Equally, it may apply even in terms of pasture renovations and improvements. You know, putting in new pastures, putting in particularly some of the later varieties that have good levels of production, but also have quite a high cost of putting them in. Certainly, if we can get the production benefit out the other side, then they're well and truly justifiable. But we have to be able to demonstrate that we are going to get a lot of production benefit as well. So those small production targets around things like our conception rates and marking rates are very important, but they should also play into our overall enterprise benchmarks in terms of productivity, and also things like our cost of production, stocking rate, and overall gross margin. So as part of the whole enterprise management, hopefully in a lot of our systems, we've actually got some measures of this information, and we have some targets that we're trying to achieve, and we also have a path at which we're going to follow to achieve those levels of production at the same time. So there are some very good benchmarks available that you can use. This is just one example that you can find on the Making More from Sheep website that gives you some guides to performance levels that suit. And equally for beef producers, we have the same level of information, you know, available to us as well. Equally, there are a number of different businesses across Australia which undertake a lot of this benchmarking information and can provide a lot of guidance in this area as well. So the next step is, once we understand that we've actually got some clear targets in mind that we're trying to achieve, and we understand that we've got the cost benefit out the other side, we need to start looking at what the season has in store for us coming this year, and what's the type of management that might be involved to achieve those targets that we're looking for. So when you start looking at the season that we've come out of, obviously we've had a winter which we didn't get very much growth, a spring where we've had some growth, but it's certainly closed up fairly quickly at this point as well. And for those of you that are on the BIGG newsletter list, you should have received, I think it was today, the BIGG bulletin, which is the climate edition, and in there there's some great information about exactly what we might be looking at for this season coming up. And Darren Ray from the Bureau of Meteorology is basically looking at what their forecasts are, is that November is likely to be a fairly dry month, with December potentially having some slightly wetter than average figures. And this is where they're talking about some potential for some storms in December, but effectively summer is looking like it's going to be fairly warm and dry. So we need to keep that in mind when we're actually looking at how we might manage the season coming up and the feed that we're using. Also, we need to look at it in terms of how we can potentially manage our feeding for stock throughout the season as well. Many of you should have also probably seen some of the tools that are available to us in terms of things like pasture system space and pasture and monitoring of pasture growth rates. Coming through the spring that we've had, it's been very interesting to see really how quickly a lot of our pasture growth rates have really declined and effectively stopped as of now. The other interesting comment that I think Georgie supplied through BIGG is that we've actually lost half our soil moisture in October alone. And that really starts to be borne out when you see how rapidly our pasture growth rates have dropped off in October to virtually nothing now. So it's very important to keep this in mind, in that when you compare this to other seasons where we would often have a little bit more growth coming out of this period onwards, we effectively cannot be banking on that from this point forward. So that needs to be considered partly from a quantity point of view, from a feed budgeting point of view, but also from a quality perspective. So at this point forward, effectively, we're not getting any growth out of many pastures anyway, and we need to be conscious that the quality is declining. So obviously I'm speaking in general here, and we will have some pasture types. So we might have some summer active lucens, or some summer forage crops, which will obviously be potentially still growing at this point and have some good quality feed. But on the whole, it's really interesting to look at really where our general pasture growth rates are going at this point. This is a fairly busy graph because it actually details the pasture growth rates over the last years as well. But basically in red is the 2017, which is the graph that we were just looking at before, and you can see how it's really plummeted. But you can also see the normal trends, or the typical trends that we've had in previous years, where we will occasionally get some longer feed growth throughout the season. So this year, we've certainly pulled up fairly quickly. And when you combine that with the fact that we had very little growth throughout winter, we're generally working with fairly low levels of feed available for us at the moment coming into summer, and waiting until we can potentially start to get some growth again next autumn. So what that means is that we need to start being very conscious of how we're going to manage stock and how we're going to manage their nutrition. And when we start looking at measuring livestock production, we need to have some tools available to us that can actually ensure that we're monitoring the right numbers and the right drivers of productivity. And effectively in sheep and cattle, one of the good measures, particularly for our breeding stock, is condition score. So many of us probably have done some condition scoring in the past. It's effectively a score of 1 to 5, where 1 is very thin and 5 is effectively mud fat. The reason that this is very important is that this is what aligns to many of the recommendations in the research in the industry about the production responses that we can get through different management techniques. So effectively, we are trying to ensure that we can have a reasonably objective measure. Certainly condition scoring is still subjective, and everyone will have slightly different attitudes to what a score 3 is, but effectively these give you the guidance as to what a score 1, a score 2, 3, 4 and 5 should all feel like. And this is one way that you can start to objectively, as much as you can, measure the condition of animals. This is, once again, relates back to that earlier slide where we're looking at how can we set these production score targets. And we have to be able to measure our animals. We have to be able to monitor how they are going in condition to be able to work forward in terms of going through and hitting our targets for production. Equally, when we're looking at data collection, condition score is important in terms of monitoring our animals at that point in time. But in terms of actually reviewing how we've performed that season, how we've managed our enterprise, we have to make sure that we also have some level of data collection throughout the season so that we can come back after the season is done and review really where we've actually succeeded really well and where potentially are some things that we can look to improve the next year. So simple things like making sure that we've actually got good levels of scanning data available to us. We haven't just simply wet and dried, or that we have conditioning, we have actually previously scanned in the first place, is actually really important information to being able to deliver on the production targets that we're trying to achieve. So whenever we set our targets, one of the really important things to actually do at the same time is to write down what's the data that we need to make sure that we can actually measure whether we're hitting those targets or not, and to be able to measure our progress towards hitting the targets that we want as well. So certainly with something like trying to improve reproductive rates, trying to improve lambing or calving rates, our scanning results, our conception rates are a critical piece of that information. If we don't have it, then we actually put ourselves in a position where it's very difficult to manage the enterprise well to improve our marking rates. And it's one of the common things that we have to work with a lot of clients is that if we have a core objective to improve lambing rates and we don't have pregnancy scanning figures, it's difficult to do anything because we don't know whether we actually haven't got the lambs on board in the first place or whether it's lamb survival that's a problem. And the management of those two different issues is actually completely different. So the importance of data collection is being able to hit the targets that we have for whatever our production system is. So when we've come through this situation, we've got to the point where we've understood the targets that we're trying to hit. We can see the season that's coming up in front of us, and we know the information that we need to monitor and the information that we need to collect on these animals. And effectively now we come to the point where we're looking at how can we now match our pasture quality with our livestock requirements. We know the condition that we have to maintain those animals in, and that purely comes down to managing the nutrition of those animals. One of the really core things to keep in mind whenever we're looking at nutrition is that it's very easy to get swamped by information on the latest and greatest little techniques in nutrition. It might be things like some new mineral nutrition, some new blocks, some new licks that are available to us. It might be, little things like flushing ewes, pre-joining or supplementing rams. All of those things are important in their own right, but we always have to look at what is the single step that's going to give us the biggest cost benefit. And to assess that, the simplest way to look at it is what is our primary limiting nutrient? If you follow that principle in nutrition, it's very hard to go wrong. And essentially all we're looking at is assessing nutrition at any one point in time and identifying what is the biggest handbrake on the system right now. Because the reality is when you start looking at nutrition, there are probably 10 or 15 different things that you could actually do to address either major or minor limitations at any one point in time. And fiddling around at the edges and dealing with some of the minor issues will actually give you very little cost benefit if we still have big issues that haven't been addressed. And that's commonly the situation. Most often, actually dealing with supplying enough energy and enough protein to the animal will get us often 80 or 90% of the way there. And the simple way to look at actually working through this process is to go through, well, what are my animal requirements? What do they need in terms of energy? How many megajoules of energy per day? Or how many grams of protein do they require per day? What's the feed that's in front of them and how much is that potentially supplying? And then you can actually work through the scenario of, well, do we have a surplus? And do we actually need to do anything about that surplus? Or do we have a deficit that would actually start to give rise to the situation where we could actually justify some supplementation to improve productivity? So that principle in terms of really just working through what is my biggest limitation and addressing that to start with is a really important principle of nutrition. And once you address that, then sure, you can start to go around and you can look at other issues as well. But you always have to look at what's my biggest limitation at any one point in time. So to actually go through that scenario, one of the things that we often do is to go through and actually work out, okay, well, how would we address the nutritional problem? And if we start to look at the season ahead, where we potentially are going to be having stock on, let's say, stubbles or even dry pastures, and if we look at some fairly low-end scenarios, so we'll go to the lower end of things, and we have, let's say, a feed which is supplying about 6 megajoules of energy per kilo of feed. So that's our measure of energy, is ME, metabolizable energy. 2% protein was actually fairly common last year. Now this season, with a fairly short growing season, that should be higher, hopefully. But if we work on that as a starting point, that gives us some guidance. NDF is neutral detergent fibre, which is one of our measures of fibre, and it is a good indicator of potential intake. So the higher that fibre content goes up, the less of a particular feed that animal will be able to eat. The lower that fibre goes, or the lower that percentage number, the more of a feed an animal can eat. And DM, the 90% DM, is just our dry matter content. So how much is actually feed and how much is water. So when we get into, summertime and potentially we're looking at feed quality here, in the new year, we've got fairly poor quality feed. We're going to have feed which won't be meeting requirements of many classes of stock. Equally, for those of us that have got some cropping country as well, and we're looking at stubbles that have been grazed out, so we're not assuming that there's grain in there anymore, this is the type of quality that we can be dealing with. And if we look at, for example, twin bearing ewes that have been joined, they're in, say, early to mid-pregnancy, then their requirements are approximately 12.8 megajoules of energy per day and 137 grams of protein per day. That's our ME and the CP columns there. The other thing that we need to work through in this scenario is to how much are they going to eat. And that NDF figure that I've got there of 70% can be used as an indicator as to how much an animal can eat. And there's an equation which is 120 over the NDF, gives you the percentage of live weight that animal will eat. So of this feed, they can eat 1.7% of their live weight, which is 1.1 kilos on a dry matter basis. So you can use that to work through. So 1.1 effectively times 6 ME gives you 6.6 megajoules per day. So that's our stubble supply there. And in many respects, just as a side note, what this is called kind of doesn't matter whether it's called stubble or it's pasture. What we're most interested in is the actual quality, the numbers. And from the protein point of view, that CP column there, we can then go, okay, that protein or that feed is going to supply 22 grams of protein per day. So we have some shortfalls there that need to be dealt with. So once again, look, this is projecting forward. This is not quality right now, but we need to be conscious of where quality is going to potentially be in the new year and actually plan towards that. So we have a deficit in energy, we have a deficit in protein, and then the next process is basically working through, well how do we deal with this? How do we actually sort out these shortfalls? Because what's going to happen is that if we haven't managed these shortfalls, then we're going to see condition fall away in those animals. And if we see condition fall away in those animals, then we start to drop down in terms of those production levels that we saw earlier. So if they've lost condition pre-joining, then we're going to see potentially our conception rates fall away. And equally, having an understanding of that relationship can help you put some numbers around the cost benefit of potentially having to supplementary feed in these situations too. So just graphically, these sorts of information these are like the rungs that are on those barrels. We've got the shortfall in energy and we've also got the shortfall in protein. If you were to come in and to make up that 500 that energy shortfall, effectively you could come in with about half a kilo of cereal grain. So it's a fair amount. And that's the reality of what we do need often when we have very low quality paddock feed, particularly for ewes that have come into pregnancy and especially when they've got twins on board. Now, as they come into late pregnancy and close to lambing, those levels of supplementation, those energy and protein requirements will get higher again. So we're talking about even more in some situations. Dealing with this energy shortfall can take quite a lot of feed. What happens in that situation is if we were just to choose cereal grain, we've got a feed source which is high in energy, but relatively low in protein compared to, say, legume grains. So we still have a shortfall in our protein requirements of those animals. And this is one of the things that often gets missed a little bit in the industry is we have a big focus on dealing with energy, but we forget about protein to a point quite often. So it's a really important part of nutrition. It's an important part to manage because particularly for pregnant animals, it has an important role in terms of the lamb or the calf development. So it can affect birth weight. And equally for merino producers, it's critical from our wool cut point of view. So we have to deal with protein at the same time. To deal with that deficit in protein, you would actually end up going away from cereal and you would probably end up going to something that's closer to a 60-40 mix of, say, lupins and a cereal grain. That would be one way of addressing that shortfall in protein at the same time. One of the important things to look at in this whole situation is how do we actually get these numbers? And when we're looking at the quality of feed, one of the important things to remember is that we can actually assess our pasture quality really objectively, and you can get a feed test done on any of your pastures, on any of your feeds that you have available, in things like hay, grain, silages, and they will return. The lab will basically give you exactly what the quality is. Now, feed testing isn't something that you have to be doing all the time. It's not something that you would necessarily, go out and test a feed every fortnight, but it is actually worthwhile doing a couple of tests, and particularly before really critical production periods. So it might be getting an understanding of feed quality coming through summer. It might be that you get another test on a couple of paddocks leading up to lambing time or late pregnancy, or potentially one of the things that's happened for a lot of areas over the last few months is making sure that we've got a good understanding of paddocks for weaners, and making sure that we have the feed quality available to young stock to really achieve the growth rates that we need to be achieving. With that information, it allows you to work through this process of really understanding what is the nutritional requirements of our animals and what are they getting out of the feed available. Once you know that process and once you know the quality of feed, it's effectively just a number crunching game like we've gone through here. Now, that type of process is something that you can work through yourself, or equally there are lots of people around that you can talk to help you work through that process. But it's worthwhile doing in that it will help you to ensure the stock achieving the production targets that you want, and also that whatever feeding you're undertaking is done in the most cost-effective manner possible. And, one of the things that I often get some feedback from people on, when we're talking about nutrition is that sometimes they find that supplementary feeding is costly and they haven't got the performance that they expected. And that is always due to the fact that we've put the wrong feed into the wrong place. And that's a really disappointing situation for everyone involved, because it can be expensive feeding, but when we use the right feed in the right place, we always get a very good cost benefit out of it. So we need to make sure that we do it well. And some of that is actually being driven by the fact that when we look at the requirements of animals, we have a base requirement for maintenance. And if we can actually ensure that we deliver as much of that from pasture as possible, and we limit the amount that we actually have to deliver through supplementary feed, we can actually try and make sure that our cost of supplementary feeding is as efficient as possible. I'll just skip back through these again. I'll just duck back to the previous slide before. But that process that you work through there that we've just discussed is the process of working through how we can actually align the pasture quality that we have in front of us and how we can test it, and also how we can actually then manipulate that feed quality and how we can meet animal requirements going forward. So that's a process that we need to be thinking about going forward in the season, and equally that process can be applied now when we're looking at paddock feed quality that is certainly probably better than what we've been dealing with in that example. But it is important to be thinking along those lines for later in the season as paddock feed quality declines, particularly leading up to some of our important activities like joining. So before we lead into some question time, I think it's just important just to go through probably a bit of a summary. And one of the important points is to understand the most important targets for your enterprise. It's very difficult to make big inroads in lots of different areas in an enterprise at one point in time. And sometimes I see when people are trying to change their enterprise in lots of different ways, we end up just making small movements and everything. And in many situations, I think it's better that we understand what are our top 2 or maybe 3 targets for the enterprise that we have to be working on, and really hammer those home and actually make some good improvements in those first of all. And to do that, we have to really determine the production data that's critical to record. So we have to make sure that we understand what are the pieces of information that will allow us, firstly, to make sure we understand exactly where we're sitting at the moment, and secondly, to understand and review how much progress we're making year to year. Make sure that we look at the season ahead against our current stock condition. So when we're actually working through some of those processes around assessing paddock feed quality and putting a feeding plan in place, if we have stock which have slipped a little bit in condition, then we have to factor that in and make sure that we've actually starting to lift them back up again, and that can change the amount that we're looking at actually feeding at one point as well. And equally, it may be that it might change things like the pasture use across the property. So if you do have some better quality feeds available with different areas of the property, then it just changes the application of that. Assess paddock feed quality we've talked about, and quantity is certainly an important part as well. We haven't touched much on that tonight, but ensuring that we look at how much feed we've got on offer and looking at feed budgeting, forward from this point is going to be pretty important this season with this winter and spring that we've had. And the other final point is just to make sure that when we're setting these targets, we have to measure our performance and how much improvement we're making. Effectively, this comes down to assessing our own management. That's what the bottom line is. It's not how the ewes or the cows have performed, it's how we manage the enterprise and how much improvement we're making year on year. So I think with that, Georgie and Carlin, we'll just take a few questions. There's a couple of resources there that you might find useful in terms of working through some of the information. So some MLA resources have information on requirements of stock, some feed quality information. But certainly, the Barossa Improved Grazing Group can help point you in the right direction if you're looking for more information. Obviously, my contact details are there as well.
Thanks very much, Hamish. If anyone's got any questions, we've definitely got some time now for questions. You can simply type them in the question box on your control panel, or if you raise your hand, I will unmute you and allow you to ask Hamish your question directly. So feel free to fire away. Any questions? Here we go. Can see Graham's got his hand up. I'm just going to unmute Graham. Did you have a question, Graham?
Yes, Hamish, we've got ewes I scored today, and they were twin-bearing ewes that were weaned in the rams off in September. They've gone from a condition score of 2.2 to about 2.8, so they're currently sitting at about 2.8, and we put the rams out in early January. I'm just wondering if you're just a bit of a gut feel, if you think we'll get there with just the pasture given that we've got an improved pasture to go on to now, but like you suggested, is running out of steam. If we need to do anything else other than like a bit of supplementation of grain in that situation.
Yeah, look, depending, it's difficult without seeing the pasture that you've got, but if you've got an improved pasture and presumably you've still got some reasonable quality in there at this stage, most improved pastures now are at the stage where we've got feed quality sitting in that sort of 8.5 to 9 ME window, which for you, which are effectively still at maintenance, is sufficient. So it will likely certainly keep those ewes in similar condition with a slight increase. I would potentially be looking at giving them a little bit of supplementation just for the next probably month or so to make sure that you do hit that minimum of a score 3 by January. And one of the other things, I guess, to keep in mind is when we do look at supplementing stock, and especially where we still need to make some gain, it's usually most effective to do it when we've still got a good quality of feed underneath them in the paddock, because you're allowing that pasture to do much of the legwork for you rather than being reliant on the grain itself. So I would be tempted, given that you still have some gain to be made, that you would look at just subbing a cereal grain is all that's required in that situation just to get the condition on. Energy is your big driver of fat deposition, of condition score in stock. So for mature animals where we're looking at just basically putting on some condition, then we're looking at a supplementary feed which is high in energy and just adequate to relatively low in protein is quite often sufficient. So you're just looking at a cereal grain, so oats or barley fits that bill quite well. So it would be fairly low rates. You'd probably be looking at often 100 or a couple hundred grams a day would be enough, but certainly the best path forward would be just to have a look at that feed quality a bit more objectively and see where it's sitting, and then you'd be able to determine that rate precisely.
Thanks, Hamish. There's a question from Jeff. He's put his hands up, so I'm just going to unmute you, Jeff. Would you like to ask your question? Are you there, Jeff? I think he's actually typed it, so I'll also read out what he's written. How to calculate intake from NDF?
Yep, sure. So we'll just work through that one a bit more. So the standard equation is 120 over the NDF, gives you the percentage of live weight of intake. So just to work through an example of that, if, for example, we have an NDF of a feed that's come back at 60%, then 120 over 60 just gives you 2. So you know at that point that the animal will be able to eat 2% of its live weight per head per day and no more. So effectively what we're saying is as that NDF goes up higher and higher, the less they'll be able to eat. For example, so if that NDF went up to 80, then 120 over 80 is 1.5. So they can now only eat 1.5% of their live weight. So the higher that NDF goes, the less they'll eat. So if you're looking at our 60%, so 120 over 60 is 2, let's assume you have a ewe which is 65 kilos. So 65 by 2% is 1.3 kilos on a dry matter basis. That's how you work through that number exercise as to how much they can potentially eat. So that number then, if you're 1.3, can then be used to calculate the total energy intake if you multiply it by the energy content that you get back on your feed test result, or you can use it to look at protein intake and those figures as well.
Okay, Bruce has got 2 questions. So, Bruce, I'll unmute you and I might get you to directly ask those questions. Right, so have you got a microphone, Bruce? On the spot, maybe not. I'll read out, hopefully I get the interpretation right. So Bruce had what might be the cereal lupin percentage and volume in the situation you used.
Yeah, so in that example, you're looking at 60% lupins and 40% cereal would give the balance to actually provide enough protein in that situation. The exact balance will vary a little bit depending on your cereal protein, but that'll be ballpark figure.
Okay, and Bruce's second comment was a lot of the South Australian merino ewes run at 75 to 80 kilos mature body weight. Do you have a comment on the efficiency of such ewes in relation to keep them at that weight, or can we downsize them a little bit?
Short answer is yes, we can. Merino ewes that are, and look, we do have quite a few big frame ewes that are sort of pushing up 75, 80 kilos. One of the things you do often find is that there's a fair range in ewe weight in many flocks as well when you actually start to really measure it closely. So some of that's condition related, but some of it's also just the natural variation in frame size within any flock. So you'll find that, if you actually correct them all back from a condition score point of view, you may well have ewes within that flock that are anywhere from 60 to 80 kilos. Or probably 60 to 90 kilos really. There is efficiency to be made in reducing ewe size when we've got them up at 80 kilos. It's not about simply going as small as you can by any means, but I think certainly a ewe that is capable of maintaining condition, and a ewe that is capable of cutting high levels of wool per kilo of body weight, and a ewe that is capable of weaning high kilograms of lamb per kilo of body weight is effectively what we're trying to push towards. And then we end up having a cap on the actual raw size. So certainly when we're looking at ewes that are in that sort of 60 to 65 kilo window, from a stocking rate point of view, they are far more preferable than having 80 kilo ewes. That's really where we get to. As you start to push, into smaller frame merino ewes like we have in some parts of the state, but obviously, more so, say your Western Vic or New England types, then we start to take the hit on many of the growth and reproductive traits as well. But effectively, in terms of a balance, the ideal sort of animal is something that's not pushing up to sort of 80 kilos live weight, because intake is in many respects driven by the size of the animal, and the bigger those animals get, effectively the more they have to produce to justify having them on the property. And in many instances, those bigger ewes don't always produce enough extra either kilos of wool or kilos of lamb to offset their increased intake, and often what equivalent is basically their stocking rate. So, yeah.
Okay, thanks, Hamish. There's a hand up here from Sandy, so I've just unmuted you. Would you like to ask your question, Sandy? No? Now try.
Hi, Hamish. How you going?
Good.
There? That's the go. That's the go.
Yeah,
now, I'm just wondering, we use confinement feeding quite a bit through this, or not this period yet, but shortly, as soon as our quality of pasture starts going down, especially on our traders and weaners. I'm trying to, just wondering, on your perspective, is the pasture ME and protein still at high quality at seed set? Is it obviously in reproduction stage when it starts setting seed, is it still got an ME of sort of 11 or not? No.
So yeah, certainly with pastures, once they go reproductive, and then once they get to seed set, they've only declined further. The only obstacles, or the only ones that will buck that trend, is if you're looking at, say, grazing a cereal crop that you put in where you actually have full grain fill there, then you're actually getting some improvement out of that grain which is developed. But yeah, for general pastures, no.
Right. Okay. So that grain, that seed set or grain in the ryegrass or whatnot, is no beneficial factor for the animal.
Yeah, not really. No.
Right, okay, cool. Thank you very much.
That's all right.
Thanks, Andy. I've got a couple of cattle questions here for you, Hamish. What digestibility ME protein to gain 1 kilo per day in a 300 to 350 kilo steer, please, from David?
No worries. To put on a kilo a day, look, what we'll do is we'll line it back to your feed test results. So ME point of view, you need somewhere around 9.8 ME and about 11.5, 12% protein will get you a kilo a day at that sort of weight range. If they're pushing right down to closer to your sort of 280, 300 kilo, then the protein will need to be higher. You'll be looking for probably closer to sort of 13, 13.5. But as they get heavier, then you start to get to the point where effectively more of the development is going away from that muscle and also some of it's getting pushed towards fat, which then basically drops your protein requirements a little bit. So yeah, so around those figures.
And then there's a second cattle question from Tom. Do those joining fat scores that you presented apply in the same context when you join beef cattle?
With beef cattle, we don't tend to see the, well, obviously the raw numbers in terms of the percentages change, but we see that same relationship apply there. What I tend to probably see in practice, I guess, with cattle is the middle ground of that window from, say, score 2 to sort of 3.5 tends to be a bit flatter with cattle than what you see with sheep. There's a little more forgiving in that middle window, but at either end of the spectrum, then certainly things drop off. And especially with cattle, you tend to see that that certainly when they get into that really over fat stage, then we have some issues. And that's one of the interesting things, I think, is that in sheep, all of that research came out with a straight line relationship. It's an interesting discussion point, and certainly that was what the results showed. But it's interesting that in every other area of biology, certainly as we get to that very top end of the condition score spectrum, things do tend to drop away as well. But we do tend to see that a little bit in cattle. I suspect at the very high fat score of sheep, we probably see some of it too. But yeah, like I say, I think in that middle ground, cattle can be a little more forgiving, but certainly the trends are there as well.
Okay, are there any more questions out there from the group tonight? We're getting towards the bottom of our list. There's a comment here from Bruce in South Australia, back to your climate variability slides, Hamish, saying that the group tonight should Google Angus in South Australia. He said there was a significant hailstorm yesterday, and he imagines it's had quite an effect on the dry feed that was out in the paddock. So just a comment from Bruce.
Yep.
Right, I think I've come to the list. And if you're out there and I haven't answered your question to Hamish, you want to put your hand up, and I think I've covered off all the ones that are being typed in here, but yep, I think we've covered it, Hamish. Thanks very much. Thanks everyone for attending tonight, and there was some good discussion there with questions, and it was really good that people actually wanted to ask their questions over the webinar, because quite often everyone's a little bit shy, so that was good to hear from people. As you exit the webinar this evening, Georgie would like to gather some information on the value of this to you, so please take a moment to complete that information and keep in touch with the BIGG group. Do you have any concluding comments there, Georgie?
Just thank you very much, Carlin and Hamish, for supporting BIGG in this webinar. You've both done a brilliant job, so thank you very much, and thank you to everybody that logged on and listened. Yeah, your feedback would be really valuable, so yeah, please let me know. Thank you very much.
Okay, good evening, everybody. See ya.